Welcome to the Coping Podcast, where we share strategies for coping with the stressors of life, especially the difficulties of parenting. And here is your host, Dr. Lee Weiss.
This is Dr. Lee Weiss. I am the host of the Coping Podcast, where I feature top experts on topics such as raising healthy children, parenting, and so much more. Past guests include Dr. Ellie Leibowitz, therapist Ben Kessler, and many more. Just a quick disclaimer, the information provided is for educational and informational purposes only. This is not intended to provide mental health treatment and does not constitute a client-therapist relationship. The information provided is not a replacement for being assessed and evaluated by a licensed professional and is not intended to replace mental health or medical advice. This episode is brought to you by Coping Partners. Coping Partners is a mental health practice in the Chicago suburbs dedicated to helping children, adolescents, and adults. We help manage various challenges, including anxiety, divorce, behavioral issues, relationship problems, and much more. Check out more episodes of our podcast and our website at copingpartners.com, and you can contact us with any questions you have. Before we dive into today's topic, I wanted to introduce our guest, who is our go-to neuropsychologist when we refer children and teens for neuropsych testing. She is also on the Catch Board, which is a wonderful community organization for parents whose mission is to help parents raise resilient and emotionally healthy kids. Dr. Lisa Novak is a co-founder of Illuminate Psychological Assessments. She earned her doctorate in clinical psychology from the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. She specializes in neuropsychological assessments for children, adolescents, and young adults. Dr. Novak's areas of specialty include learning disabilities, ADHD, and the interplay between physical and mental health concerns. Not only is Dr. Novak an incredible psychologist, she's also a mother of 2 young boys. So both Lisa and I are very invested in today's topic, not only as professionals working with kids, but also because we have our own kiddos. So this is a topic near and dear to both of us. So thank you, Dr. Novak, for being here as a repeat guest on our podcast. We could usually talk for hours on end on these topics, but you and I have been talking a lot lately about Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, how the great rewiring of childhood is causing an epidemic of mental illness. And both of us have been talking in mommy circles and professional circles alike about it. So I'm thrilled we can talk more about this topic. And I know you recently gave a wonderful talk for the Catch parent audience on this very topic. So I'm going to show the book to our parent audience. And I'm going to ask you a very general question, which is, what is Haidt referring to when he talks about this anxious generation?
It's a great question. And before I answer that, I will say thank you so much for having me back on your podcast. I'm very excited to be here. And this is a topic that I have been discussing a lot of the time at work and through the volunteer work that I do. And honestly, with the parents of my children's friends and just the community in general, and trying to raise as much awareness about this as we can. I think something really special about this topic and what Haidt refers to is that it's a community problem, which requires a collective action solution. And so the more of us that are talking about this, the better. So you asked a great question. Agree. Yeah, you asked a great question about what is he talking about when he refers to the anxious generation. And the idea is simple and also extremely complicated. The simplest version of that is that when we look at statistics and research about the levels of anxiety, depression, self-harm, and suicide in our youngsters and our preteens and our teenagers in particular, we see that in roughly the years 2010 to 2015, there is a major increase in the prevalence of each of those disorders for both boys and girls. Some affect girls more, some affect boys more. And the question really becomes why? Why are we seeing that all of a sudden at this time period, there's this incredible surge of mental illness? And the answer that Haidt proposes, which I'm a really big proponent of, is that there are really two factors coming into play at the same time. One is that we as parents are over-parenting our children in the real world. And then the second is that we are under-parenting our children online. And the reason for that time period in particular is because that's when iPhones are introduced and a lot of the apps are introduced, not the first generations of iPhones, but the ones that have reverse cameras. So we're suddenly taking selfies, the apps that have access to like buttons and sharing, and suddenly this over concern of how we're presenting ourselves on online forums. And with our exposure to that, we are just seeing incredible changes in what's happening in the brains and minds of our youngsters.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that if you have any experience with teenagers, you see that like the phone is attached to the arm. It doesn't leave their side, and the selfies and the videos, it's something that we did not experience as teenagers at all. Obviously, we didn't have the phones, but even just looking in the mirror and just the whole kind of obsession with the self.
Exactly. Obsession with the self and obsession with how those around us are perceiving that self, right?
Yep.
And that image of, needing to constantly portray that perfect image and get more likes and get more people to follow us. And it's changed the dynamic tremendously.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So I guess I'm curious if you can delve into some of the problems. I know there are many, but some of the bigger problems with smartphones and social media for this age group.
Absolutely. So Haidt talks about 4 main harms that consistent use of smartphones and social media is causing for our kids. And the way that he distinguishes there is that he starts with the first one being the social harm. So this idea of social deprivation. And what he's referring to is that the amount of time that people are spending on their phones is taking up time away from different things they used to do. One of those for the social deprivation is actual face-to-face interactions and communication with people.
Right.
And I think there was a statistic that the amount of time that teens spent with their peers has gone down so tremendously from day to day. So in 2003, research suggested that on average, teens were spending about 2.5 hours a day with their friends. And that is outside of time spent like sitting in the classroom at school. Mm-hmm. And that number dropped by 2019 to only 40 minutes a day. So from 2.5 hours to 40 minutes a day. And when we think about social interactions, some people will say, but aren't we all hyper connected now? We're talking, to our friends 24/7. But there is something to be said about real face-to-face interactions, not only being able to read the facial expressions and body language of those around us, but truly feeling connected. Mm-hmm. And we see that harm because despite this constant connection that these smartphones are providing us, the percentage of people that are endorsing feelings of pretty extreme loneliness is just going up and up and up as the years go by with more access to these devices.
And it looks different to be on a group chat, right? And kind of like in what he calls the asynchronous communication, right? So someone responds and then, an hour later, someone else might chime in versus a one-on-one, face-to-face, synchronous and real-time, communication. And it feels different. It feels emptier, the first one versus the latter. So I think that you're right. The teenagers are, and preteens even, anyone with access to the social media now, they're on it a lot. They're with people, but they're not really experiencing the filling nature of the connections.
I think you make a great point. And I would add to that there are also skills, real social skills that we need to be building that we can't build when these interactions are only asynchronous. So your perfect example of somebody sends you a text and you have a chance to read it and think about it. Maybe you're emotional about what the person said. You don't have to respond right away. A couple hours later, you can come back to it. That doesn't work in real time when you're actually interacting with others. And so there isn't as much true social problem solving that's happening. There aren't as many opportunities for that. We're not learning how to reconcile issues with friends. We're not learning how to actually work through a problem. We're maybe ignoring our problem or canceling somebody on social media instead of actually facing it the way we used to have to.
Right.
And that's really, I think, having a very big impact on social dynamics in much broader strokes.
No, that makes a lot of sense. So harm one, social deprivation. That's super helpful. And I think you're absolutely right. And obviously Jonathan Haidt is absolutely right. What would be a second main harm of social media?
So the second one he talks about is sleep deprivation. And I can speak from the neuropsychological standpoint on this one, that sleep is really and truly one of the most important things for our health as kids through to adulthood, for our physical health, for our emotional health, and to really help with regulation. How do I regulate my emotions? How do I regulate my mood and my attention? And what's happening is that people are getting significantly less sleep because of these smartphones. They are often being charged in people's bedrooms. They are keeping people awake for longer at night. And the lack of limits and parameters around those things is making it a lot harder for people to get the sleep they need in order to function effectively the next day.
I was going to say, I think any parent sees when their kids have a sleepover or something, that their kids fragment typically the next day because of the lack of sleep. So I think that we know we aren't able to be our best selves when we don't have enough sleep. And for kids, this is a big one. In my practice, I will often talk with parents about kind of phone rules when the kids get their first phone. And typically parents are not as concerned about where the phone charges as I am. And I will say, please make sure to start with the phone charging, whether it's in an office or the kitchen or your parents' room, but not the kid's bedroom. And sometimes parents will say, oh, it's no problem. They turn it off, blah, blah. And the kids will tell me, I heard it ding, or I actually did wake up to pee in the night and I checked and I realized all these messages I had missed out on. And so then they're nervous about it. And do I have to respond? And actually, I think this is interfering with sleep more than parents realize.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it feels like a no-brainer, especially if we implement it right away. As you said, when you give somebody their first phone, it's harder to do when they've already had their phones in their rooms, but it still feels like something that is one of those little nuggets of, there is something pretty simple that you can do here if you just charge the phone elsewhere. And, for the record, teens do need about 8 or 9 hours of sleep at night. Very few are actually getting that, especially these days, and especially in communities like ours, where it's not just the phones, but it's also how busy they are. And there's a lot of extracurriculars, and it's 9 o'clock by the time they get home before they've even started their homework. And so, what do you mean 8 to 9 hours of sleep? But anything that we can do to help get them the sleep that they need just feels so essential.
Absolutely. So what would be the third harm of the social media?
So the third harm he talks about is what he calls attention fragmentation. And this is the idea that we are not able to sustain our attention for nearly as long as we used to be able to. And the reason that that's connected to phones is because phones are a constant distraction. I read somewhere that on average, I think people get about 250 notifications per day, which is truly a notification every couple of minutes. And so there's no longer this, okay, I just have to sit and focus on my homework, or for me on writing my neuropsych report for the client I just saw for a 40-minute stretch and then go take a snack and a break. Because every 2 or 3 minutes we hear a ding, we have a buzz, a vibration, and all of that is constantly vying for our attention and just not allowing us to stay in that Zen focused place that we need to be able to.
Yeah. No, I was going to say, I think a lot of parents are trying to implement rules around homework time, that the phone is in another room, but the kids will say, but I need my phone to XYZ, or I need the device to help with this homework. So it's a little bit tricky in how much of it where they really do need it and how much they just want the phone. But I agree. I think adults have trouble. So you can only imagine for kids that's so much more appealing than doing their math homework, continuously for 40 minutes straight.
Absolutely. And I do want to say this is very hard for kids and for parents. And some of this is about modeling. I mean, I know that I am not a great model of phone use for my kids, and it is something that I am consistently and actively trying to work on. But the other piece, like you said, is there are logistical factors here. I'm hearing a lot about, I wasn't going to give my kid access to this social media app, but then they were on a sports team, and this is exactly how the coach is communicating with the team. And so they had to have it. There are logistical pieces at play here that we have to balance. And that's why it's not as simple as just a yes or no phone or no phone.
Of
but
course.
we have to find the ways to do the things we can. I don't think there's a reason that students need to have their phone with them when they're doing their homework. They might need access to certain websites, and having a computer or an iPad there where maybe somebody can see a little bit more as they walk by, like what's actually happening on that screen.
Right.
But it is tough.
Right. And then would you share with us the last main harm?
Yeah.
I know there are more, but of social media.
Yeah, the last one he talks about is addiction. And he recognizes, and I echo, that this is the trickiest one to really talk about. When we talk about addiction, are we really talking about that term from like a clinical and diagnostic standpoint? Are we talking about it just from a what it feels like standpoint? What he refers to is this idea that all of us feel, quote unquote, addicted to our phones. I think that's something we can all resonate with. But there is a certain portion of the population that truly becomes addicted. I think current research is suggesting it's around 14%, where life circumstances are getting impacted very adversely by the addiction to that technology. So whether it's somebody being at school and their grades are really dropping, or being at work and not being able to meet their work expectations, or it's having a very significant impact on social relationships and they're suddenly more withdrawn and not doing things that they used to be doing, that's when we lean into that space of true addiction. But for the rest of the population, where we can do our air quotes addiction, and we all know what that feels like to us, there are lots of psychologists working very hard to make these apps as addictive as possible. They want us to stay logged in. They want us to continue scrolling. And so they are tapping into the neurotransmitters in our brain, things like dopamine, that are getting us to have these hits that we feel of like, a rush of, oh, that felt really good. I posted this thing and then I just checked and there's already 12 people that like my post and it's barely been up for 5 minutes. And that doesn't satisfy us. And I think that's the biggest problem here, is that this dopamine release feels really pleasurable, but it doesn't lead to satisfaction or satiation. Instead, it leads us to keep seeking more and more and more of that, which brings us right back into our phone.
Oh boy.
Oh boy. Yeah, exactly. Oh boy. I agree.
So now that we know, right, we know there's lots of, bad effects, especially on the developing brain, of social media and the smartphone in general. But we also know that while, again, the author, Jonathan Haidt, recommends, for example, waiting until 16, for the first smartphone or for social media, we don't necessarily think that, at least again in our area and many in this country, that that's realistic for most people. And for me, again, as a parent, I can certainly say that the reason is that your child becomes the only one without. And so if they're the only one without these apps or a phone, even just the phone, they really do feel the emotional ramifications of feeling left out. And so I guess my question for you is, if you are someone who's not in an area, or again, certain private schools where they're all on the same page and they're all going to wait, much later, which is amazing and power to them. But if you're not in that circumstance, what do you think parents can do? Because you spoke at the Catch presentation beautifully about, it doesn't have to be a black or white question. It doesn't have to be, is my kid the only one left out? Or am I going to make this great choice for their developing brain?
It's a great question, and I'd love to dive into it. Before we talk about suggestions that I have for folks that already have, they've already given their kids smartphones, they already have access to social media, I do want to leave a little nugget there to say that I truly don't feel that it's too late for everyone. And I think the issue is for when we're talking to audiences right now, and we're talking to audiences of parents who have kids and their oldest is 5, and we're talking to audiences where, the parents have high schoolers and everyone's had a phone for years already. The idea of like, let's take away your phone and social media, totally unreasonable.
Mm-hmm.
But for the younger generation, and maybe this is just me being able to fall asleep at night, I feel hopeful that we actually can make a change, and that if we are talking about these things early enough and long enough and really explaining them and getting people on board, we will see communities of people, even around here, who are doing things like signing the Wait Until 8th pledge, where they and their peers are all agreeing to not give their kids smartphones until 8th grade, or for height, it's actually at the end of 8th grade. So before they
high school.
Yes. And I will say, I personally have a first grader. He just turned 7, and then a 3-year-old. And yesterday actually was the day that I got the email back from Wait Till 8th that said, congratulations, your first grade class at your kid's elementary school officially has enough people to, have onboarded. And so you are now locked into this Wait Till 8th. And it felt like a very freeing moment, and then also a very scary moment of like, okay, they're in first grade though. How do we keep up that momentum? So we don't all just, fall like flies in 5th grade, 6th, 7th grade.
No, and I appreciate you sharing that, because I should have said that more clearly. Yes, I think one of the reasons we're doing this podcast 100% is that people are, because of this book and sort of the popularity of it, parents are talking, and parents are talking throughout the whole nation in a way that they haven't before. And so I do think there's the power of the community, like you said, to make change. And I think, at least in the parent communities that I'm involved in, the younger kids, I do think, are going to have a chance at actually making this work, because they will not be the one person in their group to not have a phone or to not have, whatever the social media at the time becomes. And of course, it's always changing. So I think that's right. I think the first thing is parents who, have not yet had to deal with this. I think you'd say delay, but you can first speak on that, and then we'll move on to what if your child is of age where most people have it, and kind of how to handle that.
Well, and I think I largely did speak on that. Like, I don't know that there's so much more to say aside from the fact that we do need to band together. This is one of those issues, and it is a rare parenting issue that truly is about power in numbers. You think about most of the parenting decisions that we have to make. What time are we going to, have curfews for our kids, or are we going to force certain vegetables on them? All these things day to day that we get to choose. And it really doesn't matter what the parents around us in our community are choosing. This is a different issue for exactly the reason that you described, that it is only feasible, or I shouldn't say for all, because some people really are going against the grain, and kudos to them, and not giving their kid access to these things, even though most of their peers do have it. But that's a very hard thing to do. And it's so much easier to do if the people around you are also doing it.
So maybe on that point, though, for the younger people, one I would say action step that I'm thinking about, and that again has been talked about in our area, is really lobbying for schools to also adopt sort of the phone ban in a way that's actually effective. So not just saying we have a no phone rule, but actually having consequences when a kiddo does have a phone out. And I know we've gotten emails in our district about like the Apple Watch buzzing during the school day. So even something as simple as like, don't bring it in or put it on classroom mode so that it is not an issue. And the phones, they have all kinds of things they're doing nationwide, but Illinois is a little behind, it sounds like, so far in terms of being able to adapt the bans.
Yes, to all of that. And, I guess maybe it's worth mentioning that when in Haidt's book, In the Anxious Generation, he breaks down these next steps into these 4 main principles. And then we're going to talk about some different ones, or maybe some accommodations to, when we can't go whole hog with some of these. But what he talks about is no smartphones before high school. So that's this wait until eighth movement. And he's really clear that he's talking about smartphones. He's not talking about phones in general. There's really nothing wrong with a flip phone or a watch that allows you to text and make phone calls to, your parents and your inner circle of friends. We want kids to be able to communicate with us, especially since we actually want to be building their independence and having them biking around the neighborhood more and just hopping over to friends' houses. And I think it's okay to want to know where your kids are, but that's very different than the smartphone that gives them, the entire internet on, in their pocket and by the touch of their fingers 24/7.
Without a doubt. Right.
That's his first one. And then his second one is no social media before the age of 16. And then the third one is exactly what you were just talking about, moving into this realm of phone-free schools and what that really means and how we can implement that. And then the fourth one goes back to that first thing we talked about, where not only are we under-parenting online, but we're over-parenting our kids in the real world. And that's causing its own harms. And so his fourth tenet is more unsupervised play time and independence.
Yep. And again, interestingly, that the book has sort of taken off, and in our little neighborhood, kids are actually biking more. And the parent community are saying, come to our house, you can come to our house and pick up my kid. And they're actually doing this, which is just so cool. And I don't think the parents, now that it's been happening, now it's of course getting cold where we live, but I don't think they're actually so nervous anymore, because now that's just something we're all comfortable with. We've all built up that tolerance for it a little bit more. But I think you're right. To have a basic way of communicating, if kids are actually engaging in more unsupervised play around the neighborhood is important, right? And so you can balance the two.
Yes, absolutely. And there's a whole other podcast episode to be done here around this overprotecting of kids in the real world. And what you're alluding to now is this idea of we're parenting through the lens of safetyism, where, ensuring their safety comes first and foremost above all else. And that is true, except real safety and real harm, let's be aware of that. But let's not move so far down that path that we are actually not allowing them to build the independence and the problem-solving skills and the resilience that they need in order to be functional adolescents and adults. And we have, as a community, as a society, as a country, as a nation, moved farther and farther away from that freedom parenting. The terminology that Haidt uses is we moved from a play-based childhood to a phone-based childhood. And the truth is that shift started to happen away from a play-based childhood years before these smartphones even came out. Research will tell us that right around the 80s and 90s, for a variety of different reasons, we started to fear from a lens of to parent from a lens of fear and not from a lens of independence and growth and fostering those kinds of values in our kids. And it really has impacted them in so many ways. And then the phone just adds to all of that.
Right. Absolutely. So before we dive into, again, some of the, I'm going to call it baby steps that parents can take, kind of like moving towards what Haidt is really recommending. But again, if it feels like maybe too extreme for where they are at, I do want to kind of make sure we have options for parents to what they can do. Before we go into that, can you maybe just say a couple sentences about why it's hard for parents to not just, like you said, be the one to say no phones, no social media, if all of the friends in the friend group have it? Because I think that's a real issue too.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is probably the statement I hear most often from clients and from, friends and families around. It's, well, my kid will be socially isolated then. If everyone is making their plans on these apps and on these phones, and your child is the only one that doesn't have that, then they will likely experience some very real repercussions of that. And the truth is, those harms aren't good for our kids' mental health either. It's a really unfortunate place that we've kind of put ourselves, where parents have been having to make this decision of like, which is worse for the mental health of my kid? Giving them access to smartphones and social media before I really think their brain is ready, or having them be socially isolated because of the fact that I haven't given them those access to those things. And neither of those is a good option. It's really kind of a terrible place for parents to have had to be. And I feel for all parents who have had to make that choice. So my hope is that we get to a place where we don't have to make that choice anymore, because like I said, especially as we work with our younger kids, the more that we can get people on board with not doing that, and not giving these devices out so early, there won't be that repercussion on the other end. There won't be social isolation if all of your kids' friends also don't have access to those things.
And I should also say, I think with any parenting,
my dog meant to say hi.
I should also say that, it's not possible there's always going to be parents who kind of do things differently than you would as a parent. And so if a few kids had phones earlier than ideal, but the majority of the kids didn't, then your kiddo saying I want a phone because so-and-so has a phone would really not be a big deal for most parents. They'd go, okay, but this person doesn't have a phone and this person doesn't have a phone and this person doesn't have a phone. But I think it's the problem when again, the majority do, and you're the one who doesn't. So to your point, I think the mass appeal of people being on the same page is powerful. And also obviously we have to be careful as parents not to be judgmental and to recognize that, parents are allowed to make their own choices, but yes, they do have impact on each other. So it's very interesting, like you said.
It is. And I think every kid has said oh, but I'm the only one. And so I know you wanted to steer us into this, what can we do phase? And I'll start with an anecdote that there's a community member in my community that was telling me when I was doing this presentation a couple of weeks ago about how she started a spreadsheet basically that she's passing around to other parents in her district that asks about, does your child have a smartphone yet? And if so, what apps do they have access to? And are you holding off on certain apps, et cetera, so that people can see, because there is power in numbers, not just for us as parents, but also to bring back to the kids and say, look, I know it feels like you're the only one, but look at this entire list of other parents that have said that they haven't given their kids access to TikTok yet. Right. And I think sharing that out so that we don't feel so isolated in that process is a great way to form community and conversation around these things.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I would say up until this book, that just wasn't happening the way it is now. But again, it seems like in every community, at least people are talking amongst other parents and trying to figure that out amongst themselves. So even if there's only a few people who don't have X, Y, or Z yet, it's known. And again, there's some common ground. And those people might be having more plans together. You know what I mean? It's definitely possible but it's okay. I think that's a healthy thing. So, okay, going back to if your child, they may not have a smartphone, by the way, for this question, but what could you do, again, if you feel like waiting till high school, essentially, to get the first smartphone, or waiting till 16 to get the first app of social media? If that feels a little bit too hard, given the area and what's happened so far, what are some ideas in terms of baby steps? What can parents still do to feel like they're still being mindful of this new research and new knowledge that we are very aware of? And also, again, not being the only child without XYZ.
Yeah, great. Let's dive into a couple of these nuggets.
That was a long question.
Absolutely. Okay. Thing number one, and this is really somewhere that I've been at fault for a long time. And like I said, something I'm actively working on still is modeling good phone use for our kids. We can say all kinds of things, but if we are doing things differently, they're going to see our actions and not just hear our words. And so being mindful of when we are pulling our phones out during the day, when our kids are trying to get our attention for something, I think having our own rules around that feel good to us can be a really helpful start. And then implementing those rules within the house too, when your kids do have smartphones. One prime example, phone-free dinners. nobody brings their phone with them, not even in a pocket, to the dinner table. And that is just going to be kind of this sacred time as our family that we are talking to each other and looking each other in the face instead of straight down at our phones. We talked a lot about the sleep deprivation piece and how harmful it can be to our sleep and how disruptive it can be to our sleep, even just to have our phones plugged in beside our beds or in our rooms. And so there can be a common place in the house where everybody charges their phone overnight and not in anybody's bedroom. And that's another simple tool that we can apply there. A third idea would be to talk about places that your kids and their friends don't have access to phones. So phone-free play dates, for example. Hey, everyone wants to come over and hang out at my place. Awesome. And when we get into the front door, we check our phones at the door and we actually go hang out and talk to each other like people used to do and have fun doing all kinds of different things.
The good old days.
Yes. It's making sure that our kids' social time is not actually just them all sitting on the couch together in the basement staring at their phones. So those are a couple of really quick, simple, actionable steps within the home environment. I've got other ideas for.
I was going to say one more thought on that before we move on. Carpools seem to be an issue too, I've found. And so I think, again, when you start younger, like with the kid's first phone, and you just make it a rule, like, hey, moms, can we be all on the same page? Or dads, I should include dads too, whoever's driving these carpools, that, in the car, it could be like a half an hour, multiple days a week, that the phones are in a zipper pocket of the backpack or the sports bag or whatever, so that kids are, again, engaging and talking and listening to music, but not just playing whatever they're playing, and not even talking to each other.
Yes. And I like how you said specifically in the zipper of like a backpack, and you didn't just say on silent in their pocket, because what we know is that even when a phone is on silent, it physically being on your person, on your body, in your pocket is actually distracting in and of itself. They did all kinds of super interesting studies where people went in to take a test, and sometimes the variable was whether they had their phone sitting there on silent, even on do not disturb on the desk, whether they had it in their pocket or whether they had it outside of the room entirely. And even when nobody was actually getting notifications or buzzes, the people that had their phone elsewhere in a totally different room were consistently performing better than the ones that had it in their pocket or on the desk, even if they weren't checking it at all. So it is the presence of these devices now that is really impacting our attention. And so it's such a great idea to actually be storing it somewhere else entirely.
Yeah, absolutely. And one more thing on that one, the phone free play dates was a great one. I was going to say also, even for younger kids, sometimes kids will bring iPads to play dates or to sleepovers rather. And I think the excuse or the rationale is, well, then I can say goodnight to my parent, they can call or they can text from that device. And I think, again, it sort of takes away the purpose of a sleepover. But also then just having it there in the sleepover bag means that the kids are going to end up using it and playing some game together on the iPad rather than actually doing free play at ages where you want them to do free play. So I just wanted to put that out there too. Okay, keep going, Dr. Novak. You're doing great.
Another thing I was going to say is I think we talk about these things as very all or nothing. Either, I gave him a smartphone or I didn't. And with a smartphone comes everything, access to any app and anything they want to look up on the internet, et cetera. And it doesn't have to be that way. It's not just, okay, I've given you a smartphone and now, go forth and hither. We can be really mindful about what we're actually giving them access to. And I listened to a wonderful podcast hosted by Lisa Day Moore where she was talking about this particular issue. And her advice that really stuck with me was that she had given to her own daughter was, we are staying off of social media for now, and we are holding off on social media until it becomes the hindrance to you having a social life. And if and when there comes a time that you are no longer being included on things because everybody else is using other channels of communication, then you will tell me, what is the primary channel of communication people are using? Are they using Instagram? Are they using Snapchat? And whatever that one thing is, so that you can still be in close contact with your girlfriends, that's the thing we'll give you access to. But that doesn't mean you're also going to have access to TikTok and, all of these other things. And so reminding ourselves that we are still the parents and we do still get to make these decisions, and that we don't have to open the entire Pandora's box up to them.
Yep. I was going to say the other piece with that, and that's great advice, is limits, that there are ways on the phone to have limits set of time. So if they have one of these apps that we're not thrilled about, you can set a 20-minute timer a day, that kind of a thing, or only on the weekends, or whatever is appropriate for the situation. So that, again, like you said, it doesn't have to be all or nothing. And again, let's say you've delayed as long as you can for the first smartphone, you can have a whole list of rules around that smartphone's use to make sure that you're still making sure it doesn't take over the child's life.
Yes, absolutely. And I wanted to touch on something you said about the sleepover and, the kid wanting to be able to text their parent goodnight. I mean, that example sounds pretty, innocuous. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But it does raise this bigger issue of parents being used to having constant communication with their kids and expecting that, and then the kids becoming dependent on that. And so it brings me back to our conversation about schools and phone-free schools. And I will tell you, from every conversation I've ever had with a teacher, a school administrator, you name it, they hate these phones. They dream of true phone-free schools from bell to bell, morning to afternoon. Nobody has access to their phones. Let's go back to learning and attending and socializing and doing all the things we're supposed to be doing. Mm-hmm. Part of the pushback that they are getting is from parents who say things like, but what if my kid is freaking out because they felt like they did really poorly on the math test and they're having a panic attack and they just want and need to reach me? I don't know about you, Lee, but I grew up at a time where that wasn't a thing. I couldn't reach my parents and they couldn't reach me in the middle of class if I got a bad score on a math test, or if I just finished taking the math test and freaked out that maybe I got a bad score. And I think what we need to take a moment to acknowledge is that we are inadvertently sending messages to our kids that they do need us and that we do need to rescue them when we are there all the time.
That they can't handle it on their own.
Yes. When we are not there, they do learn to handle it on their own. And my God, the confidence that builds inside of them and the independence that it helps them create and the motivation to keep building those self-sufficiency skills that come from that are tremendous. I've had a few really great conversations with students at GBN recently, because they did just implement a no phone rule, and everything has to go into a pocket at the beginning of every class. And at first, of course, the students hated it. And then a couple of weeks in, they were like, I am learning better. I am aware of that. I'm actually happier. They're acknowledging some of these things. And the ones that were most freaked out about, what if I can't reach my parents, really were panicked about that at the beginning. But having had a few experiences of having to work through some of that adversity without immediate access to their parents, they are like, wow. And you can see the difference in them, which is really what we all need to work towards.
Without a doubt. Michelle Winterstein, who's a coping partner, and myself did a webinar for parents of kids attending overnight camp. And one of the things that we talked a lot about is how kids have no access to any screens at camp, right? They do not have access to their parents, right? And how they come back like new kids, completely grown in different ways, in terms of their skills, in terms of their confidence and ability, like you said, to handle and to weather the difficulties, whatever they might be, the social, anything. And so I think you're right. Even just in the course of the day, kids are communicating with their parents, like you said, if they, any little thing that comes up and they're getting that immediate gratification of, or immediate feeling of reassurance that the parents can provide. And so, yes, I think like, again, as parents, we need to push for schools to really do this, and schools would absolutely do this, like you said, except that so many parents don't want it. So we need to spread the word. The other piece of that I wanted to share is some parents, the reason they are so nervous about banning phones from the school day is these catastrophic, horrible things like school shootings that happen. And, the research shows that even though parents really want that instant knowledge of my kid is okay in that situation, that it actually is more endangering for kids if they all have their cell phones, because they're not able to look and follow the teacher in charge's instruction of what to do in that horrible situation, right? Which we hope never happens, but it's really not actually making them safer to have access to the phone in that moment.
It's such a good point. And it is, I think, probably, and especially around here and after July 4th in Highland Park a couple of years ago, it is probably the primary reason that parents do push up against these bans for phones at school. But it's such a great point that emotionally it makes us feel better, but from a logical, brain-based standpoint, it isn't actually helpful for us to be able to reach them at that time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before we move on to kind of my final question, any other baby steps that you would recommend for parents? I loved, again, the phone-free dinners, setting limits on screen time, modeling, do as I do, not what I say, having good rules around smartphones, particularly around nighttime, so it doesn't interfere with sleep. Anything else like that we are missing that you can share?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two other quick buckets that I just want to touch on. So one is getting other parents involved. I really think that is a very important baby step. Talking to your 2 or 3 closest friends about these things, reading the book together and having a book discussion of, look, we've already all given our kids phones, but what can we do? And really banding together. Getting for parents who are younger, getting other parents to sign the Wait Till 8th pledge. And again, really just making this a community solution, because it is and requires that collective action.
There's
and then the other,
numbers.
yeah. And then the last thing I would say is just some pieces of advice around the overparenting in the real world. I think that's another part of this that we have to acknowledge, is we have to be doing a little bit more letting go and allowing our kids to have more unsupervised time in the real world, allowing them to go bike places and meet up with their friends and have unstructured time. We are so busy and overscheduled, but it's not play. When our kids are at soccer practice or at a dance, competition, that's not free play by its nature. And so giving them chances to just be kids and teens and run around and maybe get themselves into a little bit of trouble and get some bumps and bruises and scrapes and learn from those things and develop and grow, instead of constantly trying to protect and bubble and shelter. Tiny things like that, of just literally letting them have time to hang out where they're not doing any kind of structured activity, letting them, bike farther distances than maybe you were initially feeling like you were comfortable with. Those are all little steps that I think can be really helpful too.
Even just playing in a park, right? And arranging with other moms, like whoever wants to meet up at this park at this time. So there's other kids to play with, but the idea that they can actually play without the parent hovering, play with other kids.
Completely. And I laugh about that because it's like we are literally structuring unstructured playtime for our kids, right? 10 a.m. on Sundays is when everyone's just going to go hang out on the street outside. This is a lot of the documentaries and the books and whatnot on some of these topics give this idea of like, we used to all just run around outside and play after school. We'd run to our house, we'd drop off our backpack, and then we'd go out on the street until dinner time. And even if a parent wanted to do that right now, they could send their kid out on the street, but then they're looking around and like there's nobody else to play with because everyone else is at band practice and doing, their basketball and they're this and they're that and they're home doing homework. And so It's hard. It is hard, but really re-inviting some of those pieces in and finding specific times that can be done. And we know there will be other kids out on the street or at the park to do that with. And one person, Lenore Skenazy, who is the founder of the Let Grow project, there's a wealth of resources on her website and through her programming. But one little homework assignment that all listeners can do with their kids at any age is to ask them, what is one thing that you have, for one reason or another, never done on your own that you feel ready to do? And then work with them to find something that you feel comfortable enough with and that they feel comfortable enough with, and let them do that. And you'd be surprised by the things that kids come up with when you ask that question. But it's little pieces of freedom along the way that, again, help build those essential skills for true success as an adult in this world.
I love that. I love that. So I'm going to dive into our final question for parents listening who may be interested in learning more about all of this. I'm wondering if you can share any resources that you recommend, whether they be books or movies or podcasts, anything at all.
Absolutely. So obviously, if you haven't read Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, a lot of what we're talking about today came directly from there. Outside of that, there are a couple of documentaries that I really love. One is called Chasing Childhood, and it's really not about the phones. It's about this overparenting in the real world element. And it's a fantastic documentary that I recommend to all. There's another documentary called Screenagers that many people have seen. But what I just learned, and I haven't seen it yet, but I've heard it's great, is that Screenagers has now come out with an elementary aged version that I would recommend people checking out as well. I just mentioned Lenore Skenazy's Let Grow project. Her website is letgrow.org, and she's got some wonderful resources as well. Common Sense Media is a website that I'm guessing many are familiar with, but that gives parents really helpful and reasonable guidelines around not only TV shows and movies, but also different apps and access to different kinds of technology, what age it's appropriate for, what kids might be exposed to when they access that kind of, that website or that app, et cetera. And then I do want to give a shout out to CATCH, which you mentioned at the beginning as part of my intro. So CATCH stands for Community Action Together for Children's Health. It is a 501c3 organization that has its grassroots over here in the North Shore of Chicago. And it's a wonderful, wonderful organization that really focuses on how to help support parents who are supporting their kids on this mental health journey. And so I did a presentation about this topic for CATCH, and we have tons of different programming coming up and historically that I invite you to check out. The website there is catchiscommunity.org.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Novak, for everything.
Thank you for having me. I could talk about these things for days, and
I think you're going to be
and still will.
I would say you're going to be a guest who comes at least once every couple months, right? Because we can talk forever, and it's a fun excuse to get to do that. Everyone, please check out more episodes of our podcast. Go to copingpartners.com and click on podcast and articles. And thank you, as always, for tuning in. And thank you, Dr. Novak. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Coping Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes. And check out our podcast page at copingpartners.com.